we got introduced to QGIS, the free GIS software, and thought it was really interesting. So I wanted to learn more about that and see what I could do with it. We started off by plotting all of, a handful of addresses onto the map, and I wanted to see if I could do more and then see what I could do by incorporating other maps over time. So specifically, there is a 1937 map published by the Homeowners Loan Corporation when they were developing their policy of redlining in Charlotte. This was inspired by this was part of the Mapping Inequality project that shows all these maps all over the US. So I wanted to overlay that one and overlay that with all of the different people living in Charlotte in 1911 to see if I could see any correlations or anything like that. And I also wanted to see if I could find correlations between the 1911 data set and the urban renewal projects that happened in Charlotte that were being proposed and completed around the 60s and the 70s. So to accomplish this, I started off just by plotting all the different addresses that I could find. This is made possible by a couple of previous students from a year or two ago who were able to get coordinates for like 5,632 people in our data set. So it's a little bit less than the 15,000, but it's still a good chunk of data to work with. Also, beyond just seeing the different observations that I could make with these maps, I wanted to see if, what the impact of visualizing data like this would be. I know the data sets are kind of staggered, coming from 1911, 1937, and 1972, but I just thought it would be interesting to see it all in one place. In terms of computational thinking, for data practices, a lot of the data had already been supplied to me, but I was able to get that one urban renewal map, which I will show a little bit later. I manipulated it on QGIS and also used QGIS to create some data of my own. I thought QGIS was great in helping model and simulate some of the questions I was trying to ask and visualize. Yeah, I will show you a little bit more about that in the next one. And in terms of problem solving, I thought using a map, which I had never really used before, was a great way to just understand some of this data a little bit more and give it a more human aspect. And for systems thinking practices, just being able to layer everything together and see it all in one place and think about things in layers or levels, I thought was really helpful in terms of understanding how everything worked together. So onto the data that I used. Like I said earlier, I used a variation of the data set that we were provided in this class. It already had all of the coordinates on there, or at least 5,000 of them. I have a link to the data set that I used. And I also have a link to the original notebook that I took it from. So if somebody comes along this Jupyter Notebook later and reads about it, they can hopefully look at these things. But I put that original data set into OpenRefine and tried to filter some things out a bit. So I basically just ended up taking out all of the values that didn't have coordinates, cut it down to 5,642. And then I created facets to filter out by race and whether or not the entry was an individual or a business. Ultimately, I ended up with 4 smaller data sets for Black individuals, white individuals, Black businesses, and white businesses. And I have links to all of these as well. I uploaded all these into QGIS, but I mainly ended up focusing on just the division between race here. I wanted to explore maybe some economic factors, but I ended up focusing more on race. So the maps that I used, this is the Redline map developed by the HOLC in 1937. This is a map of Charlotte. Each zone corresponds to a grade given to it by the HOLC. D is red, C is yellow, B is blue, A is green, and they basically correspond to whether or not people who live in this area would be worthy of giving a loan to by this organization. And the other map that I used was the 1972 Urban Renewal map that I got from the UNC Charlotte Library. And it shows proposed and completed urban renewal projects around Charlotte. You can see the highway here, and the green areas are proposed projects. The light green are in progress projects, and the dark blue right here is public housing. I think the light green is completed projects, light blue is proposed. So putting all this together, I'll start off by breaking everything down into the different layers, because it can get to be kind of a lot. So the initial plot looked like this. Black individuals are the blue circles and white individuals are the green diamonds. This is just overlaid on a modern map of Charlotte. There are some that were, outside of the boundaries of downtown, but I figured for the purposes of this, it'd be easier just to focus in on the downtown area. So you can see they're kind of interspersed. But when we overlay the HOLC map from 1937, we start to see some interesting things. So this is it. This is the map overlay of just Black individuals. And you can see that they are clustered in certain areas, mostly red and yellow, with a couple popping up in the green and just 2 or 3 in the blue. So you can already see some distribution here. Down for the white individuals, it's a little more spread out, but I also thought it was interesting that they are still located mostly in the red and yellow areas. However, if you compare these two maps, sorry, you might not be able to see it that well on my screen. For example, you see this cluster, Black individuals here in this zone. There are basically no white individuals here. Right here, you have a cluster of white individuals, and there's hardly any Black individuals living there too. So just that one overlay gets some interesting correlations, even though these data sets are separated by about 25 years. In addition to the map that I got from Mapping Inequality, they provided shape files, which are these polygons that I could upload into QGIS. I give them all labels according to the zone and colored them in a way that corresponded with their color up here. And with these polygons, I was able to overlay this on other maps without the need to use the entire 1937 map. So down to the urban renewal map. This one was a little tricky to overlay in QGIS. It didn't exactly correspond with a perfect map of Charlotte, but you can still see it does the job, I guess. So here's the urban renewal map with Black individuals on it. You can see that a lot of the urban renewal sites hit Black communities. This one seems to have escaped any projects, but you can see a highway cut right through it. Down here are the white individuals. There's some urban renewal projects going on over here and over here in this area. So it looks like they were also hit by some. But during my research, I was able to see that the urban renewal projects did hit Black communities much harder. So following on the theme of the polygons, I created some polygons based on this map that I could then overlay how I wanted to. I created these on my own and also created one for the highway, which was a little tricky to make, but it worked out. And again, they don't line up with the map perfectly, but they still are able to give you a general sense. So when you combine all of this stuff together, it gets a little messy with everything kind of on top of each other, but you can still see correlation. So, for example, you can see the urban renewal projects here, 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 here. Basically, all of these up here correlate with red line zones that were in red or yellow or D and C grade. And the highway cuts directly through all of these as well. The ones down here, the blue and green, are generally not affected at all. You can see urban renewal projects and the red line all hit Black communities pretty hard across the board. And here it is for white communities as well. It looks like the place where it was most intermingled, I guess, was here. This is the First Ward neighborhood of Charlotte. It's got a pretty good mix of people, and it would be interesting to know more about this neighborhood, what the economic factors of that were, or the socioeconomic factors of that would be. Yeah. So for a cleaner view, here is just the polygons without any of the population points, so you can more clearly see how redlining and urban renewal are intertwined, I guess, even though they are separated by about 40 years. And you can see how some of the polygons that I made were a little bit off. For example, you see this boundary over here. This should actually be matching up with B1 right here. So if I were to go back and do this, or maybe, I was working on this more long-term, getting these polygons more correct would, I think, lead to a better project. But I was able to make some calculations as well. I tried to simulate what it would be like if the 1911 population was living during the time of urban renewal and who would be affected. So I was able to select everybody in the data set who was living in an urban renewal project area. And I found that 39% of the people affected would be Black and 61 would be white. And in the data set, only 32% of the people were Black, which indicates a disproportionate effect. I thought it would be interesting to see what the numbers would be like if you had a data set or a population from the 70s closer to urban renewal. But I think it's interesting that you can see a disproportionate correlation even with data that's 60 years old, or 60 years earlier than urban renewal. Similarly, I selected people based on where they would live for redlining. So I selected all the individuals that were living in an HOLC zone. And then I was able to join the attributes of the redline data and our original 1911 data set and combine those into one table. So it would show the individual, all of their qualities from the 1911 data set, as well as the zone that they lived in and the grade. So this is a table, it's a sample of that. You have the person, and over here you have their grade and ID that's given to their zone by the HOLC. And a quick example of how you can use that data for the full data set, it shows that the people who would be living in areas A and B had a lower percentage of its employed residents as laborers, 8% and 2% respectively, compared to people living or who would be living in C and D, which were 12% and 16%. I mean, I think further analysis on this using something like Tableau or Neo4j or some of the other tools that we used might provide some more insight into the economic disparity of 1911 and its influence on future policies such as redlining and urban renewal. Throughout all this, I think the most value would be applying similar methodology to data sets in different periods of time, or those that are much closer to the redlining or urban renewal policies. But seeing this all plotted out on a map while I was doing it hit me a little differently than if I had just read about it. For example, seeing the highway kind of cut through those neighborhoods and knowing that people had set down roots there for decades and decades just made it a little more personal than, just reading about it. And here I wrote down just some challenges and possible next steps. But yeah, that is pretty much it. Basically, some of the data wasn't necessarily accurate. I wish I had more data that I could use And there's a lot more potential for fleshing